Just no middle.
What is what?
Just no middle.
You said for the posterior view?
For the posterior view, besides the perpendicular plate, you can also see the superior and the middle nasal conchae, C-O-N-C-H-A-E. That's the plural. If you take the E off the end, you get the singular, C-O-N-C-H-A-E. And in Latin, CHs stand for a K sound. As in trochanter, for instance, T-R-O-C-H-A-N-T-E-R, the CH always stands for a K sound. And then the short take on pronunciation. The scientific terminology is easy to spell because it's pretty much spelled phonetically. If you just spell it out, just pronounce it the way it's spelled, you'll be right more than 99% of the time without knowing the exceptions. And the exceptions are that CHs are pronounced as a K. C's in classical Latin are always a K sound also, as in the C in cut. Then in classical Latin, AE stands for an I sound. Okay. And then what we call the letter V in English stood for a W sound in classical Latin. So AVE in classical Latin was pronounced Ave rather than Ave. In medieval Latin, it's pronounced Ave, as in Ave Maria, for instance. In classical Latin, AVE was pronounced Ave. E's at the ends of words are always pronounced. Okay, so therefore, just to give a little example of how this works. In Latin, C-A-E-S-E-R is pronounced Kaiser because the C at the beginning stands for K in pronunciation, and the A-E is an I sound. So therefore, the Romans didn't say, Hail Caesar, they said, Hail Kaiser. And then the Germans adopted that term for their ruler, who became Die Kaiser, in the Germanic tribes. So when the gladiators, before the fights, looked up at the Kaiser, they didn't say, Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. They said, Aue Kaiser, moratori te salutant. Moratori te salutant means we who are about to die salute you. Or they might say, Aue Imperator, emperor, as well. And then in the plural, they would say, if the two gladiators did it, Aue Kaiser, moratori te salutamus. Okay. So if you know those exceptions, you can get the pronunciations correct 100% of the time, just 99.98% of the time, if you just pronounce it the way it's spelled. Okay. So now, if you see anything else that you want me to identify before we make an end of it on these cranial bones, I'll do it if you draw my attention to it. Otherwise, I'm going on to vertebrae. So you should take out the vertebra handout. And then also, you just go back to the part of the atlas which has the pictures of the vertebrae. You can look at them in the atlas as well. But I don't have those images in this show yet. I'm still editing them for optimal on-screen presentation. I don't have them in by Tuesday. So I'm going to have those pictures that are in the atlas in the show by Tuesday. I'll just flash through those at this time. But right now you have the handout. And so what I'll do on the test is that I will show the images from the handout and the ones in the atlas both. When I ask a question about a particular vertebra, I'll show both the image from the handout and also the image from the atlas as well. Now there are certain images that are only in the atlas, and then there are others that are only in the handout. So there are for certain questions I would have to use just the handout for the image, and for other questions I I would have to use just what's in the atlas. But now, of course, you should know the different kinds of vertebrae, cervical, which I imagine you do, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. So let's start out with cervical. And now, what I want to do is show a typical cervical vertebra from the middle of the range, of the cervical range of vertebrae. And then I'll go back to the unusual ones. The ones at the end of the range are atypical, especially the first two. The ones in the middle of the cervical range are typical, like this one. So find this in the handout. And you should, first of all, let's go over some general vertebral characteristics that are present not only in cervicals, but also in thoracics and lumbars as well, and to an extent in sacrals, although not so much in coccygeals. So here are some standard vertebral characteristics which you should know, and I will ask some of these on the test. First of all, you should know that there are three main parts to a vertebra. This part, called the vertebral arch, with a number of subdivisions. I'm going to go back and point out the subdivisions in a moment. That's this part, the vertebral arch. Now this is a cervical version of a mid-range cervical version of a vertebral arch. The arch looks somewhat different at other levels, but there's still a vertebral arch there. Then there's this, the vertebral body. This is a cervical vertebral body, the kind you see in the mid-range of cervical vertebrae. The proportions of the body differ at some other levels, but there's a body present nevertheless. Then we have the vertebral foramen. This is as you see it in the middle of the cervical range. The proportions of the foramen differ at some other levels, and you can use these differences to tell you what you're looking at, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, or sacral. Now, sticking off, well, first of all, before I go over things that stick off the vertebral arch, let's go over the major subdivisions of the arch, and then I'll discuss things that project from the arch thereafter. So here are the things that make up the arch. The laminae. Each of these is a lamina, L-A-M-I-N-A. And if you put an E on the end, you get the plural, lamina. So each arch has two laminae, which make a major portion of the arch. They make the roof of the arch. Question? Now here, these are called the pedicles. This is a pedicle, and this is a pedicle. Thoracics and lumbars and even sacrals also have pedicles, but they're oriented differently rather than projecting dorsolaterally like this. They project somewhat differently in some of the other levels, but there are still pedicles there. So you can think of them as little pillars holding up the roof of the arch. Then sticking off the arch, there's this. This is called the spinous process. The exact proportions of the spinous process differ at different levels, but in most cases there's a spinous process there, although C1 doesn't have a full spinous process. And coccygeal vertebrae are usually missing laminae and also the spinous process as well. Then projecting to the sides, there are these transverse processes. And then here, there's an articular process with articular facets in it. This is a cranial view. This is an articular facet, and here's another articular facet. Those are the actual articular surfaces on an articular process. So in a view from lateral, you'd see the process but not the facets. You have to have either a cranial or a caudal view to see the facets. Okay. So let's go over some characteristics of different cervical vertebrae. Now, first of all, you should, for the test, you should know that this is a cervical vertebra in the range of C3 through C5. And then for the physical, I won't ask you how you know on the on-screen test, but I am going to ask that on the physical reality test. And a lot of the questions on vertebrae in the physical reality test, the A would be which one? With the limits of precision mentioned in class, state which one for A. And then for B, how do you know? It's that in particular. So this is how you can tell that this one is a cervical in the range of C3 through C5. Now here is a transverse process on this vertebra. I'm going to go back to a general characteristic before I mention what I'm going to hold off on what I was just about to say. And first of all, I want to point out another generality about, I want to point out a generality about cervicals. I pointed out some generalities about vertebrae overall, but now let's point out a generality about cervicals in particular. And that is this. Each of these is called a foramen transversarium, although in English you can say transverse foramen. I'll take that as well. It sounds similar because the word transverse in English comes from a Latin word. There are a lot of imports from Latin in the English language, and that's one of them. And only cervicals have foramina transversarium. You could say have transverse foramen. So the short take is that if you see a vertebra has a transverse foramen, and even the atypical ones have transverse foramen, then it's a cervical. And if it doesn't have a transverse foramen, it can't be a cervical. So the presence of a transverse foramen in a vertebra excludes all the other kinds. You don't even have to think about the characteristics that would make a vertebra a thoracic or a lumbar and so on if you see a transverse foramen, because it's impossible that it would be one of those. That's using the exclusionary principle. If there's a transverse foramen there, it can't be a thoracic, a lumbar, a sacral, or a coccygeal. It has to be cervical. And if it doesn't have a transverse foramen, then cervical vertebrae are excluded. You don't have to even think about the characteristics of cervical vertebrae because it's being a cervical vertebrae is impossible. So just start looking for identifiers for one of the other kinds. Now, and then also note this, in the middle of the cervical range, look at this body and note that the lateral to lateral dimension is greater than the anterior to posterior dimension. So it's a wide oval because of what I just said. The lateral to lateral dimension is greater than the anterior to posterior dimension. Now that's different in thoracic, at a thoracic level though. It's similar at a lumbar level, but there are some other differences which say lumbar. Okay, when you see an intermediate thoracic, let's look at an intermediate thoracic and see which number this is. So go right back to it. So here's an intermediate thoracic, right here. This is a thoracic in the range of T5 through T7. Now look at this body. Look at this number. And just compare that to this. Look at this. Look at the proportions of this body. Notice how much wider the body is than the A to P dimension. And then look at this. Notice that in this intermediate thoracic now, the A to P dimension is as great or greater than the side to side dimension. So that's quite different. It's still a body, but it's different from what you see in a mid-range cervical. This is a mid-range thoracic. And notice the difference in proportions of the body. And let's go on with some other comparisons before I get into some details about C3 to C5. Look at this once again. The vertebral foramen is pretty close to being triangular, whereas in this mid-range thoracic, it's round. So one of the things that identifies this as a mid-range thoracic is that the A to P dimension of the body is as great or greater than the side to side dimension. And you have a round vertebral foramen.